James Thompson wiped his hands on the old rag hanging from his belt as he locked up Murphy's gouge for the night. The cold October wind cut through his thin jacket, making him pull it tighter round his shoulders. At 34, James looked older than his years. His face was weathered from too many nights sleeping poorly and too many days working harder than his body wanted to allow. The small trailer he called home sat at the very edge of Millbrook, a sleepy English town where everyone knew their neighbors, and nothing much ever changed. James had moved there 3 years ago after his injury forced him out of the Royal Navy. He had been a proud engineer then, working on the big ships and feeling like he was making a difference. Now, he fixed old cars for barely enough money to keep food on his table. But James never complained. He was grateful that old Tom Murphy had given him work when nobody else would. Tom paid him just enough to cover his rent and buy simple meals, and James made it stretch. He had learned to live on very little during the hard months after he first came to Millbrook. The rain started as James began his walk home along the main road. At first it was just a light drizzle, but within minutes it became a heavy downpour that soaked through his jacket and made the road slippery under his worn boots. James kept his head down and walked faster, thinking about the warm cup of tea he would make when he got home. That was when he heard the sound. Even through the noise of the rain, James could recognize the troubled cough of an engine in distress. He looked up and saw a silver car pulled over on the shoulder of the road about 50 yards ahead. Its hazard lights blinked weakly through the rain. Like a cry for help, James paused for a moment. He was tired, cold, and wet. His trailer was only another 10 minutes away, and he had already put in a full day at the gouge. But something made him walk toward the car instead of continuing. Home dot as he got closer. He could see someone sitting inside. The windows were fogged up from the rain and the person's breathing, but he could make out the shape of a woman. She looked opposite, maybe even a little frightened. James knocked gently on the driver's side window, being careful not to startle her. The woman looked up at him through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. James could understand why she might be nervous about a strange man approaching her car on a dark, rainy night dot, but then she rolled down the window just a few inches. The woman appeared to be in her 40s, with kind eyes that looked worried and tired. Her clothes were nice, much nicer than anything James owned, and he could tell she was not from Millbrook. "Evening, miss," James said, giving her his warmest smile despite the rain dripping from his hair and running down his face. "Looks like you're having some car trouble. Can I help you?" The woman studied his face carefully. James knew he looked rough round the edges, with his old work clothes and calloused hands, but something in his eyes must have convinced her that he meant no harm. "Yes, thank you," she said. Rolling the window down a bit more, the car started making terrible noises. "About 5 minutes ago," and then it just died completely. "I'm Margaret Davies. I'm supposed to be in London tonight for a very important business meeting. I'm James," he replied, already walking round to the front of the car. "Let me have a look under the hood, if that's all right with you. I work at the garage here in town, so I know a thing or two about engines." Margaret nodded and pulled the hood release. James lifted the hood and pulled out the small flashlight he always carried in his jacket pocket. The beam was weak, but it was enough to let him see the engine. He listened carefully to the sounds it made when Margaret tried to start it again. James had been working on engines since he was a teenager, helping his father in their family garage. Even in the dim light and pouring rain, he could quickly tell what was wrong. The timing belt had slipped, which was causing the engine to run poorly and then stop completely. It was the kind of problem that would normally cost hundreds of pounds to fix at a proper garage, But James had learned to be resourceful during his difficult years since leaving the Navy. He had the basic tools he needed in his jacket pockets, and his experienced hands knew how to work by feel when he could not see clearly. For the next hour, James worked in the heavy rain. The water ran down his neck and soaked through his clothes, but he kept working steadily. His fingers were cold and stiff, but they moved with the skill that came from years of practice. Margaret offered several times to call for help or to pay for a proper mechanic, but James just smiled and told her to stay warm in the car. When he finally finished, the engine purred like it was brand new. James closed the hood and walked back to Margaret's window, water streaming from his clothes. "How much do I owe you?" Margaret asked, already reaching for her purse. James shook his head firmly. "Nothing at all, miss. Sometimes we just need to help each other out. You drive safely now, and I hope your meeting goes well." Before Margaret could say anything more or insist on paying him, James had stepped back from the car and started walking away into the rainy darkness. She watched his figure disappear as she pulled back onto the road, her heart full of gratitude for the stranger who had saved her night. James walked the last few minutes to his trailer, where a single light in the window welcomed him home. Margaret Davies gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove through the dark, empty roads toward London. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. But her mind was not on the rain or the road ahead. She could not stop thinking about the man who had just saved her evening. James Thompson. She repeated his name in her mind as she drove. There had been something special about him. Something that went far beyond his ability to fix her car in the pouring rain. She had met many skilled mechanics and engineers in her years running Davies Manufacturing, but none of them had impressed her quite like this stranger from a small town. Margaret was not just any business traveler rushing to London. As regional director of Davies Manufacturing, she controlled one of Britain's largest companies. The meeting she was heading to would decide where they would build their next major factory. A decision that would bring hundreds of good jobs to whichever community they chose. But as the miles passed, Margaret found her thoughts returning again and again to James. His expertise with engines was obvious, but what struck her most was his character. Here was a man who clearly had very little money, working in the rain with basic tools, yet he had refused payment without even thinking about it. In her world of business deals and profit margins, such genuine kindness was rare. When Margaret finally reached London at 3 in the morning, she was exhausted, but her mind was still working. She had an idea forming, but she needed to know more about James Thompson first. The next morning, after her successful business meeting, Margaret made several phone calls from a London hotel room. She had connections throughout Britain, people who could find information quickly and quietly. What they told her about James made her heart heavy with sadness and filled her with a growing determination. James Thompson was indeed a decorated Royal Navy engineer, just as she had suspected from his skilled work on her car. He had served his country with honor for 12 years, working on some of the Navy's most important ships. But a serious injury during a training exercise had ended his military career early, leaving him with a small disability pension that barely covered his basic needs. The more Margaret learned, the more convinced she became that fate had brought them together on that rainy road. He was a man with incredible skills and perfect character, struggling to survive in a job that paid him almost nothing. Meanwhile, her company was looking for exactly the kind of person James appeared to be. Back in Millbrook, James woke up in his small trailer as the morning sun came through his thin curtains. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world clean and fresh. James made his usual simple breakfast of tea and toast. using the last of his bread until he could afford to buy more later in the week, before heading to work. James stopped to check on his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Emily Watson. The old woman lived alone in a tiny cottage next to his trailer, and James had made it his habit to look in on her each morning and evening. Today, he noticed that the latch on her garden gate had broken in the storm. "Don't you worry about that, Mrs. Watson," James said, already pulling out his tools. "I'll have it fixed in no time." Mrs. Watson watched him work with the same skill and care he brought to everything he did. "You're a good lad, James," she said, her voice warm with affection. "Always helping others, never thinking of yourself. Mark my words, one day someone is going to help you the same way you help everyone else." James smiled as he tested the repaired gate latch. "I've got everything I need, Mrs. Watson. My health, work that I enjoy, and good neighbors like you. What more could a man ask for?" But as James walked toward Murphy's Gouge, he allowed his mind to wander into dreams he rarely let himself think about. Maybe someday, if he saved enough money, he could open his own small gouge. He could train young people the way his father had trained him, passing on the skills that had served him so well throughout his life. The thought made him smile, even though he knew that on his current wages, such dreams would take many years to come true. When James arrived at the gouge, old Tom Murphy was waiting for him with an unusual expression of excitement on his weathered face. Tom had owned the gouge for 30 years, and James had rarely seen him look so interested in anything. "James, lad," Tom said, walking quickly over to where James was hanging up his jacket. "The strangest thing happened this morning. Someone called asking about you. Wouldn't leave a name, but they asked a lot of questions about your work, your background, how long you've been here." James paused in the middle of putting on his work coveralls. "What kind of questions?" "Professional stuff," Tom replied, scratching his grey head. "Wanted to know about your skills, your character, how you get along with people. Seemed very interested in everything about you. Said they might call back later." James shrugged, puzzled, but not particularly worried. He could not imagine who would be asking about him or why. Probably just someone looking for a mechanic recommendation. "You know how word gets round in small towns," Tom nodded, but his expression remained curious. "Maybe so, lad. But something about it felt different, important, if you know what I mean." James smiled and picked up his tools, ready to start another day of work. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness the night before had set in motion events that would soon change his life completely. James was enjoying his quiet Wednesday morning routine when the thunderous sound of helicopter rotors shattered the peaceful silence of Millbrook. He had just finished his breakfast and was washing his single plate and cup when the noise grew so loud that it seemed to shake his small trailer. He rushed outside, shielding his eyes against the bright morning sun as he looked up at the sky. A sleek blue helicopter was circling overhead, its rotors creating a wind that bent the grass in the empty field behind his home. James had never seen a helicopter this close before, and he certainly could not imagine why one would be flying over their quiet little town. All around the neighborhood, doors were opening and people were stepping outside. Mrs. Watson appeared at her garden gate, clutching the fence with both hands as she stared up at the sky with wide, curious eyes. The Johnsons from across the road came out with their 3 young children, who pointed excitedly at the flying machine. Even grumpy old Mr. Peters, who rarely spoke to anyone, stood in his doorway watching the unusual sight. The helicopter made one complete circle over the field, then slowly descended toward the ground. James stepped back instinctively as the powerful wind from the rotors whipped his hair and clothes round his body. The machine landed with surprising gentleness in the middle of the field, its blue paint gleaming in the sunlight dot as the rotors began to slow down. James felt his heart beating faster with confusion and worry. Why would a helicopter land so close to his trailer? Had something terrible happened? Was someone in trouble? His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made any sense. The helicopter door opened, and out stepped a woman in a navy blue business suit. Even from a distance, James recognized her immediately. It was Margaret Davies, the woman whose car he had fixed in the rain just 2 nights ago. Behind her came 2 other people, a man and a woman, both dressed in expensive-looking clothes and carrying leather folders under their arms. The 3 visitors walked directly toward James, their shoes making soft sounds on the damp grass. James suddenly became very aware of his appearance. He was wearing his oldest work clothes, the ones he saved for his messiest jobs round the trailer. His hands still had traces of oil under the fingernails from yesterday's work at Murphy's Gulch, and his boots were muddy from walking through the wet grass. "Hello again, James," Margaret said with the same warm smile he remembered from their meeting on the rainy road. "I told you I had an important meeting in London the other night. Well, it went very well, and it has led me back to you." James quickly removed his cap and ran his nervous fingers through his unkempt hair. He glanced down at all his neighbors, who were still watching from their doorways and windows, then looked back at Margaret with complete confusion. "I'm sorry, miss, but I don't understand," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "What's this all about? Why are you here with a helicopter?" Margaret's eyes seemed to sparkle with excitement as she looked at him. "James, what you did for me 2 nights ago was not just fixing an engine. You showed me something I had been looking for without even knowing it myself. You showed me true character." She paused and gestured toward the 2 people standing behind her. "These are my colleagues from Davies Manufacturing. We are one of Britain's largest companies, and we are opening a new manufacturing facility right here in this area. We need someone very special to head our maintenance and training operations." Margaret reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope with James's name written on the front in elegant handwriting. "Inside this envelope is a job offer, James, a proper salary that is many times what you earn now, full medical and dental benefits, a housing allowance, and the opportunity to eventually run your own training center where you can teach young people the skills you have mastered." James stared at the envelope as if it were something magical that might disappear if he moved too quickly. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out to take it, but then he pulled back. "But ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm just a mechanic who fixes old cars at the local garage. I work for pocket money, just enough to pay my rent and buy food. Surely you need someone with fancy university degrees and important qualifications for a job like that." Margaret stepped closer to him, her voice becoming gentle and sincere. "James, let me tell you what I need. I need someone who will stop on a rainy night to help a complete stranger. I need someone who will work for an hour in a storm, using basic tools and his own skill, to solve a complex problem. Most importantly, I need someone who will do all of that and then refuse payment because he believes in helping others." She held out the envelope again. "What I need is someone who will fix a stranger's car in the rain without asking for anything in return. That tells me more about your character and your qualifications than any university degree ever." James looked round at his neighbors, who were still watching with amazement. Mrs. Watson gave him an encouraging nod and a big smile. Even Mr. Peters was looking at him with something that might have been respect. James sat alone in his small trailer that evening, staring at the papers spread across his tiny kitchen table. The job offer from Margaret Davies lay open in front of him. And no matter how many times he read the numbers, they still seemed impossible to believe. The salary was more money than James had ever imagined earning in his entire life. It was 10 times what Tom Murphy paid him at the Gouge, maybe more. The benefits package included medical care, dental care, and even money to help him find a proper place to live. But what amazed him most was the description of the job itself: running a maintenance department, training young workers, using all the skills he had learned during his years in the Navy and afterward. James picked up the papers and read through them again slowly, making sure he understood every word. This was the kind of opportunity he had dreamed about during his loneliest nights in the trailer. The kind of future he had imagined, but never truly believed could happen to someone like him. But as the sun began to set outside his small window, doubt crept into his mind like shadows growing longer on the ground. James pushed the papers away and put his head in his hands. What if I'm not good enough? He whispered to himself in the empty trailer. What if I accept this job and then I let them down? What if I make mistakes and disappoint Margaret after she took such a chance on me? The more he thought about it, the more worried he became. James had never worked for a big company before. He had never managed other people or dealt with corporate procedures. All his experience was in small places like Murphy's Gouge, where everyone knew each other and the work was simple and straightforward. A gentle knock on his trailer door interrupted his worried thoughts. James looked up, surprised to have a visitor so late in the evening. When he opened the door, he found Mrs. Watson standing on his small step, holding a pot of tea in her hands and wearing her familiar knowing smile. I heard about your important visitor today, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The whole neighborhood has been talking about nothing else. That helicopter certainly caused quite a stir. Mrs. Watson settled herself into James's one armchair, the same chair where she had sat many times before when she needed his help with something round her cottage. She poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to James, then looked at him with the sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Now then, she said in her gentle but firm voice, what's got you looking so troubled? You should be celebrating tonight, not sitting here looking like the world is about to end. James sat down across from her and explained his fears, his voice heavy with uncertainty and self-doubt. He told her about the important job, the big salary, and all the responsibilities that would come with the position. But mostly he talked about his worry that he was not smart enough or experienced enough to succeed in such an important role. Mrs. Watson listened quietly, nodding with understanding and never interrupting. She had always been a good listener, and James had often found comfort in her wisdom during his difficult years in Millbrook. When he finished speaking, Mrs. Watson was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea and looking at him with thoughtful eyes. James, dear boy, she said finally, leaning forward in her chair, I have been watching you for 3 years now. Ever since the day you moved into that trailer, I have seen you help every neighbor who asked, and many who did not ask but needed help anyway. I have seen you fix every broken thing, solve every problem, never asking for anything in return. She paused and set down her teacup. Do you think character like yours is common? Do you think integrity like yours grows on trees? Do you think there are many people in this world who would work for an hour in the pouring rain to help a complete straw? Anchor, then refuse payment. James started to speak, but Mrs. Watson held up her weathered hand to stop him. That woman who came here today in her helicopter, she did not offer you this job because she felt sorry for you, Mrs. Watson continued, her voice growing stronger. She offered it because she recognized something special in you, something rare and valuable. She saw what I have seen, what everyone in this neighborhood has seen." She leaned forward and took his hands in hers. Her skin was soft and wrinkled, but her grip was firm and sure. "Don't let fear rob you of the chance to help even more people," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "You have been helping this little neighborhood for 3 years. Now you have the chance to help hundreds of people, maybe thousands. Are you going to let that opportunity slip away because you're afraid?" That night, James lay in his narrow bed thinking about Mrs. Watson's words. When morning came, he knew what he had to do, with hands that trembled but a heart that was determined. James picked up his old telephone and dialed the number Margaret Davies had given him. When she answered, he took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change his life forever. "Miss Davies," he said, his voice stronger than he felt, "I would like to accept your job offer." The transition was not easy, learning company procedures, managing teams of workers, adapting to the corporate environment. Everything challenged James in ways he had never experienced before. But his authentic leadership style, his ability to solve complex problems with creativity and common sense, and his genuine care for every person he worked with quickly earned him respect throughout the company. Within just a few months, James had transformed not only the maintenance department, but the entire company culture. Workers felt valued and heard. Problems were solved with innovation rather than complaints. And productivity soared to levels the company had never seen before. 2 years had passed since that rainy night when James fixed Margaret Davies' car on the side of the road. Now, he stood in front of a beautiful new building with large glass windows that sparkled in the morning sunlight. Above the main entrance, carved in elegant letters, were the words Thompson Skills Center. Seeing his own name displayed so proudly still made James feel amazed and humble at the same time. What had started as a simple job offer had grown into something far beyond anything James could have imagined in his wildest dreams. The building behind him was not just a workplace, but a place of hope and opportunity for the entire community. Inside the Thompson Skills Center, young people from all different backgrounds came every day to learn valuable skills that would help them build better lives. Some were teenagers who had struggled in traditional schools but discovered they had a gift for working with their hands. Others were adults who had lost their jobs and needed to learn new trades. The center welcomed everyone with open arms and patient instruction. James had made sure that military veterans like himself had a special place in the program. These men and women, who had served their country with honor, now found new purpose, using their experience to guide and teach the next generation. They understood what it meant to face difficult challenges and overcome them, and they shared that strength with their students. The impact on Millbrook and the surrounding area had been remarkable. Local unemployment had dropped to the lowest levels anyone could remember. Young people who might have left town looking for opportunities now had reasons to stay and build their futures close to home. Other companies throughout Britain had begun copying their model, creating similar programs in their own communities. Today was the official ribbon-cutting ceremony to celebrate the center's 2nd anniversary. A crowd of several hundred people had gathered for the occasion, filling the parking lot and spilling out onto the nearby streets. James looked out at the sea of familiar and friendly faces, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Margaret Davies stood beside him, wearing another of her professional business suits. But her smile was bright and warm with genuine satisfaction. She had become much more than James's employer over these 2 years. She was a mentor, a friend, and someone who had believed in him when he could barely believe in himself. "You know, James," Margaret said quietly as they prepared for the ceremony to begin, "that night when you fixed my car in the rain, I thought I was the one receiving help. But looking at all this, She gestured toward the crowd and the building. "I realize you taught me something far more valuable than automotive repair." James looked at her with curious eyes, waiting for her to continue. "You taught me that real success is not measured in profit margins or quarterly reports," Margaret said. Her voice filled with emotion. "Success is measured in lives touched, communities lifted, and opportunities created for others." James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked out at the crowd gathered for the ceremony. There was Mrs. Watson in the front row, her elderly face beaming with pride and joy. She had helped him believe in himself when fear tried to hold him back, and now she was here to celebrate his success. Behind her stood Tom Murphy and several of James's former colleagues from Murphy's Gulch. Tom had initially been worried about losing his best worker, but he had come to understand that James was meant for bigger things. The old garage owner now sent some of his most promising young mechanics to train at the Thompson Center. Throughout the crowd, James could see dozens of young faces of current and former students. These were people whose lives had been changed by the opportunities created here. Some had gone on to start their own businesses. Others had found good jobs with steady pay and benefits. And all of them had discovered skills and confidence they never knew they possessed. When the time came for James to speak, he stepped up to the microphone with the same nervous excitement he had felt 2 years ago when Margaret first offered him the job. But now his voice was stronger, more confident. "I used to think I was just a man with grease under his fingernails," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I thought my only value was in fixing broken engines and solving mechanical problems, but I have learned something important over these past years." He paused, looking at all the faces watching him with attention and respect. "Every one of us has something valuable to offer," James continued. "We all have skills, experiences, and wisdom that can help others. Sometimes all we need is someone to believe in us, and the courage to believe in ourselves." Margaret stepped forward with the large scissors, and together she and James cut the ceremonial ribbon. As the bright red ribbon fell away, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Children threw confetti into the air, and cameras flashed as people captured the moment as the celebration continued round him. James thought back to that rainy night 2 years ago, when he had made a simple choice to help a stranger. One act of kindness, one moment of putting someone else's needs before his own comfort, had unlocked doors he never even knew existed. Mrs. Watson shuffled up to him through the crowd, her eyes misty with tears of happiness. She took his hands in hers, just as she had done that night in his trailer when he was afraid to accept Margaret's offer. "I told you someone would help you the same way you help others," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But really, James, you helped yourself by being exactly who you are." That evening, after all the guests had gone home and the celebration was over, James walked slowly through his thriving training center. In the workshops, he could see the projects that students had been working on, each one representing someone's dream of a better future. In the classrooms, textbooks and tools waited for tomorrow's lessons. As he walked through the quiet building, James understood the greatest truth of all. When we give from the heart, expecting nothing in return, we often receive far more than we ever gave. The end.